Cool. So yeah, let's dive in, and forgive me, like I said, it's demo day here at my apartment, so my apologies, but bear with me. So I want to transition to introduce our guest speaker today. Today's conversation is really about the need to think differently about what flexible work looks and feels like, what it has meant in the last 10 to 15 years, and how it has evolved won't be the same even 5 years from now, right? So kind of this notion of what author Marshall Goldsmith says, like what got you here won't get you there, right? And what won't keep you here. So I think that's paramount when we talk about the future of flexible working. And I'd argue that it's time to really completely overhaul how we think about it, how we talk about it, the words and language that we use, how it's implemented, and who all it serves. And that's what our guest speaker is here to talk with us about today. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Lauren Daley. She's a subject matter expert on women in the future of work. She's developed cutting edge research and built innovative learning products. She's conducted data-driven consulting for companies and leaders. She's a recognized future of work thought leader, and her work has been featured in outlets like the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, CNBC, Thrive Global, and Fortune. Lauren has also worked as a counselor in university career services and in private practice. So we're really happy to have you here, Lauren. The timing couldn't be better for this conversation. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, when you have questions for Lauren, just put them in the chat and I will do my best to call on you to ask your question. So Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you for having me here today. I'm so excited. This is my first call, so I'm looking forward to joining more in the future as well. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And my Mac is giving me difficulty based on privacy settings.
We can have someone else share the slides too.
Okay, if you could do that, yeah.
Alex or Brandon, do you want to see if you can't pull them up?
Yeah, hang on.
When we talk about change and disruption in the future of work, we're living it in the moment.
Hey, Lauren, could you send us the slides?
Yeah, I sent them a few minutes ago.
Yeah. So while we're waiting for those, I can go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about, why I'm so passionate about this and why I'm so excited about this conversation. As Ashley mentioned, I've been thinking and writing and researching about the future of work for many years now, and have been working remotely for many years as well. And so, as Ashley said, the language doesn't quite fit. The models that we are using, haven't stayed on pace with change. And we know that change is coming. It's disruptive. It's going to only keep accelerating. And so how do we help organizations and leaders meet the demands of this moment? How do we help them rethink and reimagine what is possible when it comes to workplace flexibility? Many times when I am talking to executives about making work more flexible, more human, more inclusive, there's a lot of interest and openness to talking about it. But when it gets to doing the actual work of thinking of how to do something differently, or kind of busting some myths and opening up access to new roles, new industries, sometimes there's pushback. And so, I think it's important for us to talk about that pushback, talk about all of the shifts that are impacting workplace flexibility as we think about how to drive this conversation forward into the future. And so before we get into workplace flexibility specifically, I thought it was helpful to give a quick overview on some of the trends that are impacting and some of the shifts that are happening in the workplace right now. And, one of the first trends that I think we have to call out is around, if you can go to the next slide, please, on how emerging technology is changing workplaces and jobs. So when we're thinking about, what work is today, it's going to be when we were thinking about what work was, 6 months ago when ChatGPT kind of came on stage, it's very different. And we know that it's going to continue to evolve and shift and change. We will likely form teams with humans and machines. It will both augment and automate certain jobs, roles, and tasks. And it shows that the roles we thought that were previously not at risk for automation will also see far-reaching impacts. My view is that it's not a doom and gloom, machines are taking our jobs scenario. We have an opportunity here to create equity, to create more access to good jobs, good roles, but new skills will be needed as we look to the future. And it's crucial that we keep equity in mind as we create these reskilling and upskilling programs. And as our work becomes more automated and augmented by machines, our uniquely human skills like empathy, collaboration, adaptability, those will become more important into the future, in addition to our technical skills. And one final note, we know that machines can learn and have bias. So to build a more equitable future of work, we must ensure that algorithms, AI, and other emerging tech is developed by diverse teams and monitored to keep bias from impacting and redoing the old patterns and old ways. So next slide, please. And speaking of reskilling and upskilling, as organizations meet the demands of emerging technology and looking at how this technology can create more workplace flexibility, focusing on the essential skills needed for success and training and meeting the demands of this moment, whether that's through open talent, reskilling and upskilling, quick routes to getting up to speed. We know that the pace of change is accelerating. We know that the pace of skills are accelerating. And so making sure that we keep up with that, especially when it comes to leading flexible workplaces. What skills do leaders need to be able to lead flexible workplaces and reimagine what work looks like? Which leads me to the next area. You could go to the next slide. Another area I identified is around the shifting paradigm of life and work. And so when we're thinking about workplace flexibility, it's not just because it's, something that can help workers manage their schedules. Really, there's been a shift around expectations and what people want and what the relationship they have with work in their lives. So this isn't just about work-life integration. It goes beyond that. It's about expecting inclusion, expecting leave, expecting corporate social responsibility, expecting organizations to be in line with their values and to make statements that are out in line with social movements that are happening. And all of that is happening at the same time as this revolution around workplace flexibility. So the paradigm is really shifting around what work means in our lives. And workplace flexibility is a great way for organizations to start to meet those demands, meet those changing expectations, and look to the future. If we could go to the next slide, please. And finally, when we're thinking about workplace flexibility, we know that from previous research, flexible work works for everyone. However, for women, it's a true game changer. As we've seen through the remote and flexible work revolution in the pandemic, work can now occur across time and distance to better respond to customer needs and provide better business continuity. It also can help us address talent shortages by thinking beyond schedules and locations, geographic areas, and the types of workers that might typically fit into a role to create flexible workplaces that work for everyone. Future Forum in some Pulse research in June 2021 found that flexibility ranked second only to compensation in determining job satisfaction. 93% of desk workers want a flexible schedule, while 76% wanted flexibility in where they work. And I think traditionally what we've been seeing is when we talk about workplace flexibility, it typically centers around those two things, around schedule or location. Can you adjust your schedule? Can you work a compressed work week? Can you trade shifts? Can you work remotely or in a hybrid way? And what I'm really hoping we can do today is expand on that conversation of how can we do this in different ways that go beyond schedule and location, because we know there's a demand from the business side, but also from the worker side. One other quick note, Catalyst research found that women with childcare responsibilities who had access to remote work were 32% less likely to report intending to leave their job compared to women with childcare responsibilities who do not have access to remote work. And so again, when we think about it, just knowing that you have access, that was enough to say, I'm less likely to leave my job in the study. And I think it's really important, not all roles can work remotely. And I always say yet, because of that emerging technology picture, that can change the kinds of jobs and functions that can work remotely. But it's important to know that workplace flexibility is really the bottom line here, that if we want work to work for women, if we want work to work for everyone, then we can do things differently, and we have to. And to that, a lot of talk during the pandemic was about women leaving the workplace. There was a lot of concern when looking at labor force data that women were leaving at higher rates than men. And yes, that was true. There's a lot of complex factors around it. But what we found now is, and many economists and researchers like myself are, thinking that it's actually because of the work from home and workplace flexibility revolution that women now have more access than ever before to remote work, to flexible work options. We want to see that continue to grow. So Business Insider did a recent study, and they looked at the work from home revolution during the pandemic. Actually, now women have returned to the labor force at higher rates than men in the United States. And that they postulate that actually that we expanded the workforce by 1.3 million women since the pandemic, purely from having more flexible work options. There's a lot of other factors that can come into it, but flexible work options were one of the determining factors. So it's really important as we think about the future. If we want to build more diverse teams, we want to build more inclusion, we want to be innovative, how do we help address these needs? And again, we know that flexible work's not just for women, but it is a game changer for women's career. So knowing all of these topics and conversations, the headlines are out there every day that leaders and companies are pulling back on flexible work options. There's one group that I want to talk about before we get into the discussion that I think is often left out of this conversation. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Research shows that deskless workers want flexibility as well. And I think that's a really important and critical element to bring to this conversation. When we're talking about how to make work in different ways, we have to consider who has the privilege right now to work remotely, and then who doesn't, who has the privilege to work flexibly, and going beyond schedule and location. How do we make work better? How do we make it flexible for everyone across roles and industries? And, I think it really takes rethinking and innovating along this, because according to a BCG study, it was global, 37% of deskless workers were planning to leave their job in the next 6 months. And of those planning to leave, the top reasons were lack of flexibility or work-life balance, lack of career advancement and pay. So flexibility is critically important when we're thinking about industries that we might not easily think of being flexible. And so how do we do work differently? How do we expand access? How do we solve this issue, not just for deskless workers, but for everyone? So we don't default to thinking that it's not possible. How do we push the envelope and create new solutions to rethink what is possible? And so with that, I just want to say, when we talk about the old way of work, it didn't actually work that well for many people. There's some reminiscing from executives about, I want to go back to before the pandemic when, work made sense, when everything felt more comfortable. The reality is change is going to continue to come. And the old way of working didn't work for a lot of groups of people in the workforce. And so keeping that in mind, again, as we rethink what's possible, how do we make work more flexible is really important going into the future. So on the last slide, I have 2 questions there that I'd like to help guide our discussion today around how do we change the conversation? How do we start to shift how we're talking about it, what the language is around workplace flexibility to rethink what is possible? And part of that is, what data do we need to help make the business case? I would love to think that executives are doing this because it's helpful for their workers, helpful, showing empathy and helping them be able to contribute to their communities in different ways. But we know we need to have that business case. So how do we shift that conversation? What data do we need? And then what do leaders truly need? Do they need more data? They have data. We have data. We talk about flexible work. People who work flexibly quite often are more productive, but yet there's this sense that people aren't working, they're not productive. So if we don't need more data, what do we need so we can help leaders expand access to workplace flexibility?
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for those 2 discussion questions. Anyone want to weigh in on that? Give us a silver bullet.
I would love to jump in. And first off, full disclosure, we are members of Catalyst, Lauren, so are aware of certainly the research that Catalyst has put out. I just wanted to share this because I started my morning this morning with an internal dialogue with a group of managers that we're doing just listening sessions, and several and it was the women who really spoke up about this, and they said they have young families, that on the one hand they love the flexibility, and on the other end of the spectrum that actually becomes another form of enslavement. I don't know a better, because it's that always on problem. And I think that's part of the challenge we have in this new work space, is we can never step away from it, even if we have flex, built in. And my company is really committed to it. So we have truly realized that, but it doesn't solve the problems. It shifts them around a bit. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that we're going to have to keep grappling with. Again, my company is a traditional employer. But it impacts those who are working freelance as well, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's such an important point to remember. And a lot of times when I'm talking to leaders and executives about this, workplace flexibility has been around for a lot longer than the pandemic, but many new organizations who thought maybe it wasn't possible quickly made it possible if they could, with sometimes changes that we expected to happen perhaps in 3 to 5, 10 years around accepting workplace flexibility, happen sometimes in 3 to 5, 10 days in some industries. And so, emergency workplace flexibility is not the same as optimized and intentional workplace flexibility going into the future. So how do we create those structures, processes, policies to help make it so people don't feel that sense of, everything's blurred now, life and work, and I'm always on? How do we put parameters? How do we role model around that to, help our people, but also make sure that we're making it as optimized as we can for the work that's getting done. And speaking of Catalyst, I lead future of work efforts for our Women in the Future of Work team. And next Friday will actually be my last day as I think about freelancing and joining the open talent community myself, doing some research and consulting. So, the sense of disruption and change, we're all living it. And, I'm really excited about thinking of how to do things a little bit differently, not just on my own, but also in researching and talking about these issues.
Thanks, Lauren. Ben?
Hey, Lauren, it's great to see you. Lauren is one of my favorite former colleagues because I spent some time before Open Assembly at Catalyst. And I just, wanted to give a plug. I walked away from every conversation just blown away. And so one of the things that I'm really keen on is, have you found there to be specific champions, whether it's functional types like product folks or revenue folks, who tend to drive more impact around the conversation of redesigning work?
I think that's such a great question, Ben. Champions often come from different areas and different roles and functions. And I think, as when you're thinking about innovation and you're, let's take design thinking, for example, people who are skilled in design thinking or UX and EX and CX, we're thinking about the end user a lot of times. We're using empathy to understand the needs and concerns. And so, I think workplace flexibility as a product is really how I'm starting to think about this a little bit differently. It's, our culture is a product, workplace flexibility, and making it optimized. And, when you're starting, moving from emergency remote work to that MVP can be really helpful. Beyond that, I think traditionally it can be from anyone in the organization. And for a lot of companies, when you leave it to the individual department and team level, you will see those champions emerge. It might not always be from HR or from DEI departments. It might be from product. It can sometimes be down to an individual manager who's comfort with it or not, comfortable with it, who has comfort with it or is not comfortable. And so, I think as we start to redesign work, who should be doing that? Are there, people using data? Is it research? What I'm starting to see a trend toward is that companies who are really intentional about workplace flexibility are leading heads of departments who are senior executives to make that transformation intentional, and not just when they're done, be like, okay, we're good. You have to keep iterating on it. You have to keep moving, gathering data to know that it's working or not working. And so having an executive in charge of that and a team who's actually looking at it, refining it, iterating, and continuing to drive that conversation forward is, I think, becoming a pretty clear best practice.
Matt, you wanted to weigh in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I loved the presentation. Thank you for that so much. I had a conversation with a CEO, and it made me start thinking about something that I really hadn't heard discussed, and this group is the perfect group to bounce it off of. So he was saying how much he missed. We were at a gathering. It was like a forced, not forced, but a social gathering for the company, everybody to get together and socialize when we're normally not in the office anymore. And he said, to me, like, I really miss this. I miss having everybody here, and it's so hard. He's like, I talked to other CEOs, and we don't know how to do this and bring people together. And it struck me how earnest he was in that missing of that. But I was like, I understand why, because his job really is being able to talk to everyone across the entire organization whenever he wants to. That's his job, and he can't do that job anymore. And it's not even, office space and collaboration, but it's this thing that I was like, oh, this is what you're missing, is you're used to being able to touch everybody whenever you wanted in terms of a conversation, and you can't that way, and you have to learn a new way to do that digitally. That's going to be really hard, right? And so I just hadn't really heard that discussed in an empathetic way towards these decision makers. Like, that's their job. People who have other things to do, knowledge workers, it's actually better for them to not commute and stay home and focus and not be in an office. Of course, they're going to be better versus people that have to, work on an assembly floor and need to work together. And as you said, I thought that was great to bring up too. Like, how can we make that work also in a flexible way so those people are happier? Like, that kind of got lost. Just awesome content. So I just wanted to bounce that idea that, like, CEOs, C-suite has the weirdest job that was the most disrupted and almost impossible to put back together for them in a lot of ways. It's kind of, it was a weird light bulb for me. So just wondering if anybody else had that thought.
I'd like to quickly share one thought and then open it up, because I would love to hear other people's perspectives here. For me, I think you have a really important point. Everybody is going to have a different perspective on here. And when you talk about empathy, having empathy for everyone is important. And when we think about how CEOs have kind of risen through the ranks, they're doing what has worked for them for many, many years. That's what they know. That's what they're comfortable with. And I think, many workers are doing that. We are working with how we've been trained and what we know. And the constant that we're going to have going forward is that change is going to continue to come. And so having that, there's Catalyst research that we've done on adaptability, and adaptability is a key skill for leaders when it comes to making these shifts that are necessary in the future of work. And for me, it's not an either or, that you're either flexible or you're not. It's about finding what works for your organization that allows you to have the most flexibility, and giving people the most choice around where, when, how, and why they're working, so they can have that sense of meaning and really figure out how they work best and where they work best and when they work best, and then figuring out what works best for the organization as well. So I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, well said, Lauren. Kathy, yeah. I know you had a comment on Matt's.
So I was speaking to 30 CEOs mid-market from staffing and talent acquisition firms a couple of weeks ago, and their concern over the non-concrete job functions that happen between teammates. he had a very mature sales staff and then hired another very new team of business developers, and they were struggling to get on board. And when he looked back into how it used to happen, it was they would sit, they'd do a plug-in with a more mature staff salesperson, or they'd go along with them on a call, and so part of the unspoken job of especially the seniors who are the most qualified to work remotely needed to be really emphasized, because it wasn't in their job description. When they looked at their job, they didn't add in being available for questions for a newer team member, or taking someone with you on a call last minute just because you were talking about it and wanted them to get that experience. The other thing that was really painful for them was that they had said, everybody go home, and now I want everyone to come back. And the trust between themselves and their teams, they felt very hypocritical. And so we were talking about some experience. Some of those staffing companies had tried it, like everyone's coming back to the office unless their GP dollars are this amount from the month before. So it became recognition to be able to work remote. And then when they said, we just want everybody back at least 2 days a week, it was punitive then for the folks that had taken it as they had earned the privilege to not have to come in the office. So they were in a big jam. And so we had to talk about things like the decision they made as a CEO at a point in time was to keep their team safe, which meant everybody go home. But in order to keep their business rolling, some of them have had to say, you trusted me to do the right thing then. I'm asking you to trust me that we're doing the right thing now by trying to put our team back together in some ways. Now, obviously, yes, you can mentor other than remotely, but you have to purposely mentor when you're remote. You have to purposely put time on the calendar to call this person, where it used to just happen naturally. And that goes to Matt's comment about what is the job of the C-suite, is to make sure those interactions are happening. But they used to just be able to step in and go, hey, I was just talking to Matt. Let's meet in the conference room and talk for 10 minutes about this issue, this client, and boom. Now they have to purposefully do it. And that is a different skill. I've talked to so many CEOs who their magic is their presence and their charisma, and they're seizing the moment when things are happening. And that's very different than being strategic and planning it all out. And they are struggling because they feel very hypocritical at the same point to ask people to come back when they rewarded their senior people by saying, well, as long as your finances are good. And I think it reflects on we don't consciously think about all the moments of contact in an office that go to build a team and to give people someone other than their boss to run things by. And that's what they're missing, is that natural tendency. So it's complex for sure.
Those are great points, Kathy. Thank you so much. And I want to call on Lorraine next, and then John Healy. I know you're smiling. I know you had mentioned something about where mentorship can happen, right? And I want to also get your thoughts on language too. So Lorraine first.
Hi, thank you. So this is very interesting. When you talk about the role of CEOs, so perhaps the role of CEOs is outdated. We're constantly disrupting things, and things are constantly changing. And the way that companies existed in the past obviously doesn't work now. So the CEO that sort of has to be present, that's a relic of the past. The CEO has to be strategic. Otherwise, how are you going to grow your business if you don't have that strategy? A CEO that just has charisma, what are they going to, like, they can't grow any business. You know, if their job is to turn up and be charming, like, what is that to support the growth of a business? You know, I'd rather meet them in the pub. And if meetings aren't deliberate, then what's the point of a meeting? For me, it's a waste of time being at a cooler. I mean, I have friends in my community. I don't need friends my friends that I work with, we are very deliberate about what we do. And this is the way I think you can be more productive. And this is the way business grows, by being deliberate. This sort of, it might happen incidentally. I'm not sure how many things happen incidentally. You have to be deliberate in your conversation. You have to be deliberate in your action, because this is where the magic happens. This is where the growth happens, not in, I'm meeting you, over the cooler. You aren't really going to find out anything. You might find out the gossip, but you won't find out anything that's really strategic about the organization, because it's not the context. And that's why I feel remote teams, it doesn't matter whether you're remote or face-to-face, you have to be deliberate. And one thing that people keep talking about is, remote work is a luxury. Remote work is not a luxury. People who don't live in global capitals, this is where opportunity happens. Why do I have to live in New York or in San Francisco to have the good jobs? Why can't I live in Nairobi or in a small city in the middle of England, or in a small city in the middle of the US? Why do I have to move to these big places to have the good jobs? And this is where remote work really has changed economic development, because it means that jobs are now equal. You don't have to be in the city to have the same job as you would in the past. So it's not a luxury. It's not, you're good, your sales are good, you deserve to work remotely. It provides opportunity for everyone. So I think we have to really reconfigure the reasons why we're promoting remote. It's not a luxury, not that so I can fold my laundry while I'm doing a meeting. It's so that I can have a job no matter where I am, where I live.
Thanks, Lorraine. John, I'd love for you to weigh in here.
It's almost, I want to go back to John Windsor and the start of this group. And if we look at the first playbook, it's about a network mindset. This is a mindset. If you have leaders who never operated remotely, I love, Lorraine, your reference of being deliberate. I had the pleasure and the opportunity to be a remote worker for 20 years before COVID. And you had to learn how to work with a team. You had to learn how to make it not a disadvantage to not be in the room. You had to choose, when do I need to come to be in the room? How do I make the time to spend with the people that are going to be important for me to learn from, or to learn from me? And those are choices that you make along the way. But if you ever find yourself saying, well, it used to be, that's the first indication that you're living in the past, and we got to step out and just kind of pause. So, to me, I go back to this wheel that John has put together, and this community has put together of learning and experimenting and doing that self-assessment of understanding where you are, and taking the time to think about your own mindset and making that shift and beginning a new journey. How do we look at the way work gets done differently? Because it's changing. You can look at any of the people who have joined these calls in this community who have come from organizations that were large legacy organizations. I look at Steve and NASA and think of this large government operation that is very structured and bureaucratic in many ways, but also one of the most innovative organizations in another way. And that didn't come because people said, well, this is how we've always done it. Like the nature of innovation comes from doing things a little bit differently. And I guess I get frustrated at the old conversations of, this is why we need to do it, or we need to get everyone back to the office. I think the magnet versus mandate conversation is a really simple one to put out to people. And I don't care whether you're declaring it as 2 days a week or 4 days a week or 5 days a week or 1 day a month. If there's no purpose behind it and there's nothing deliberate, then there is no reason for that. So, I think that also hits on, Lorraine, you made the points about kind of democratizing access to opportunity for workers and for organizations. This is about getting to abundance versus scarcity. And I think opportunity abounds. So I'll pause from droning on.
I love all your droning. I would just add, this is 150 years of organizational model that is transitioning, and like that's just going to be painful and hard for so many people to even conceive. Like they can't even conceive that there is a successful model outside of what has worked for generations. And the thing that's been successful in convincing people that a new model is needed is to take a step back and say, hey, look, you need to look at the volume and rate of change out there. Your old model cannot work in this new environment. You have to pivot or you will die. And I truly believe that. So that's the limited success I am having tends to happen when I make that argument successful.
Unfortunately, Steve, and again, from a traditional employer perspective, I think there's the feeling that if we just pedal faster, we're going to keep up. And the lack of appreciation for the exponential nature of the change, that, you know, it's going to require some pain, I think, before the realization sets in.
Ask that cowboy why his horse isn't going any faster.
Whip it harder. That's right. Yeah.
Well said, Bob. Thanks. Lauren, do you kind of want to take us home? Any other gut reactions to what we've talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, it's such again, these conversations, they're not easy, and it resonates so much with what we're seeing in the data, what we're hearing, you know, and talking to leaders. The old way of work, you know, didn't work for many people, but for those who it did work for, you know, of course, there's going to be some change resistance. How do we shift that perception? How do we help, you know, how do we help change be easier to transition to? And then how do we help make it intentional? I think that's really such an important point. Because if we're not intentional, then it's really easy for, you know, like meeting creep, for instance. If you have been intentional about cutting your meetings back, but you're not following up on that, it's very easy for meeting creep to start sneaking back in. If you're not intentional about building inclusive workplaces, if you're not intentionally addressing, you know, who's getting hired, who's not getting hired, who's getting promoted, especially in a flexible workplace model where some people have more access to leaders who are on site, or, you know, we're comfortable with people who are like us, and then we have access to. It's really important that we're being intentional in how we're driving this forward. And the sense that change is coming. It is the only constant that I see whenever I'm looking at the trends from here on out, or we're talking about Workplace 2030. You know, disruption is going to continue to come from within our organizations and then from outside. And so understanding, you know, again, that sense of needing to adapt or fail right now, adaptability is such a key skill to be able to handle this transition to the new world of work.
The only other thing I'd throw in, Ashley, is that we're really early in this model of developing tools that are designed for this new environment. Up to this point, we've been adapting the tools that we had to deal with a new way of operating. And so we're starting to see some first generation tools come out that will make things easier. So again, the ability to adapt is going to be more recognized and more visible from those who are using those tools from the beginning of their career, as opposed to those of us who are changing. So we've learned all about the digital natives and how they adopted things much easier. Start looking at the next generation of workforce that's coming in and see what they're using and what they're attracted to that makes them more effective. It's a giant opportunity for learning and self-growth.
Yeah, and for all of us to be open to learning from them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well said, John. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. This was another great discussion. Lauren, we're so happy that you're here, and I hope folks on the call will continue to learn from you and connect with you afterwards. And so our next call will be on Thursday, August 3rd. Jerry Wind is back from the Wharton School at UPenn. He'll be sharing his premise on how the development of AI presents major challenges and opportunities to organizations' talent strategies, specifically in open talent. So definitely check back with us in 2 weeks and make sure you're signed up for that. But yeah, that's all I got. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone. I put a little link in the chat here that's for Jerry's presentation. this link to the article, AI and customer engagement. So check that out before next call.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. Good to see
Thanks.
you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lauren.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.